Hello there, and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I'm Vlad, and this is season 15, episode 48. We are live across all platforms with Puey, but it's supposed to be pronounced as Puey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Puey. That's
Puey.
right.
I tried to get it right. I was afraid because this is live. People are going to make fun of me, but it's all good. So Paul Puey is the co-founder and CEO of EdgeWallet. EdgeWallet is a very popular, lightweight, privacy-centric mobile and also desktop wallet that you can use for your Bitcoin. And it also has lots of features, and it's pretty interesting. I remember the last time I interviewed you, it was for Bitcoin Magazine back in 2019, I think, or
Yeah.
2018. And we did a very nice breakdown of the types of privacy that you have in Bitcoin. And I thought that was super useful. And I'm really happy that I met you last week in Nashville, where I also
Mhm.
got this sweet t-shirt with free
Yep.
Ross.
Got one
And
of those.
welcome on the show, Paul.
Hey, thanks for having me on this show. I remember our conversations, and I've seen a lot of the conversations you've been having on Twitter. I think you're definitely getting into what I won't call it the fight, but I'd say the discussions that need to be had in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency space. So appreciate you having me as well to join in on the discussion.
Well, it's a lot of fun in both cases, both the Twitter side and the conversation side.
Yeah.
And let's get into Edge Wallet, I think, because it's pretty interesting. It has lots of features. Since I last interviewed you, you have added quite a few features. I don't recall there being this swap function that I discovered today while doing some testing. And it also has more coins that are supported.
Yeah. So when we last chatted, maybe it was 2018. We definitely had very, very minimal functionality at the time. The goal of Edge is actually to be less a wallet. And I know that our Twitter handles Edge Wallet, but really our goal is to be a self-custody exchange and to compete with the centralized exchange services. That's where people are today. That's what people are demanding as far as functionality in an app. They're wanting to buy, sell, and trade. And even the wallets like a MetaMask that someone might use that have minimal amount of that functionality, they use to connect to DeFi protocols that let them buy, sell, trade, earn yield, a lot of the financial primitives and financial services on top of just Bitcoin and crypto. And so since we had launched, yes, you're right, we have added the ability to trade inside of the app. We support, gosh, I've lost count, like maybe upwards of 12 to 16 different swap exchanges, which include more than half a dozen different decentralized exchanges. And that's where we've really been focusing on over the past years, is getting people into decentralized exchanges like Thorchain, and decentralized same chain exchanges and aggregators and bridges like LeFi and Rango, which we just recently integrated. And other decentralized cross-chain exchanges are definitely on the radar, such as Maya Protocol, which will support soon to be supporting, I believe, Zcash. We're big into privacy. Our last discussion was about privacy. We want to support the privacy coins. And then Saridex, I've talked with the founder, Luke, about that, which will then give Monero support within the decentralized exchange space. So that's been a big focus of ours, as well as obviously like earning yield. The different things that people use DeFi for, but have to go through all the hoops of getting a wallet, securing the keys, getting an exchange account to be able to buy crypto, and then doing like a wallet connect in order to connect to a DeFi protocol to do the thing you want. We want to combine that into one experience, much like the traditional finance space and also the centralized services like a Coinbase will integrate all that into one service experience. But of course, we fundamentally feel like we need to do that in such a way that people still hold their own keys, have their own funds, and have a high level of privacy.
Yeah, I want to ask you what it's like to be based in the US and work on a wallet that prioritizes privacy over everything else. And I know it's been pretty rough out there for privacy projects. So, how is it? Because basically, you're providing people a way to circumvent the requirement to KYC and AML to centralized exchanges by using all of these protocols.
So I think we're not circumventing the requirement in the self-custody space. You simply that requirement isn't there, or at least we're definitively in a much grayer area where there hasn't been the definitive um, clamp down on and creation of that requirement. So the entire cryptocurrency space, if you think about it, is one gigantic big gray area, with it being, kind of whitish gray on one end to being very, very dark gray on the other end. And with many disruptive technologies, that's just the kind of space that you're in when the rules aren't set in a very hardened way, and they're not really set in a hardened way yet today. Then you have to operate in a manner such that, hey, build what people want and drive adoption of that use case and of that type of product. And then, of course, as things start to catch up, work with regulators to harden rules that are in the favor of the user base, but first establish that user base. And of course, we're not trying to create and facilitate illicit activity, but even within just a standard user that has no malicious intent, they want this level of functionality. They want to be able to access decentralized protocols to buy, sell, trade, earn yield from anywhere in the world and not have to give up personal information, which once they do that, that personal information is at risk, whether that be name, phone number, email, social security number. And really what we're doing is we are protecting privacy, not by taking information and necessarily encrypting it, which we also do with private keys, but we're also just simply not collecting it. So there's two facets to allowing user to be private. One is take what is sensitive and hide it. And the other is take what's sensitive and don't require it in the first place. If you don't require it in the first place, you've significantly lowered the odds of that sensitive information leaking out into the world, and thereby compromising that user's both privacy and what people forget is sometimes even your security. When the amount of funds you hold and where you hold it are associated with your name and your address and your phone number, you effectively become a target. And so privacy equals security from even just like a physical security point of view. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to like, well, how is it working in the US? Actually, right now, it generally speaking has not been a problem, but I'm not going to say that that will be that way forever. My hope is that our industry moves fast enough, gets adopted by enough people such that the people mandate what they want out of the rule set and regulation, and that continues to create an environment that's friendly for crypto companies and privacy-focused companies like us.
Yeah, I hope so too, because honestly, last week when I was in Nashville, I realized that there is this single point of failure where everyone counts on Donald Trump winning and being very friendly with Bitcoin. And if that's not going to happen, we're gonna get more of Elizabeth Warren's anti-crypto army,
Mhm.
which I think right now is taking. I don't want to have a political conversation. I don't think it's the right place or the right time to have this. But it's
Probably not in Nashville
also
anymore.
fragile
Yeah.
when you think
Yeah.
about it.
No, it is fragile for sure. I think regardless of who wins, there's clearly been a mindset shift compared to where we were around this time last year. So I think there's some benefit to that because people realize that, hey, there's a presidential election, but there are like the president isn't the single ruler of a country like the U.S. At least the U.S. is not structured that way. That balance of power, which is a unique introduction that the founders of this country had created, allow for this disagreement across different states, of which elect senators and House of Representatives, and we're seeing this groundswell of representatives back and support crypto by and large. And so while it will be, I'd say, yes, a net positive for um, the Democrats to lose for crypto, whether that be lose to Trump or personally for me and RFK, because I think he's more pro Bitcoin crypto at heart. For them to lose would be a net positive. I think overall we're in a much more net positive environment right now than we were last year. So even without the election not having happened, there's already that notable pushback against um, politicians that are very anti-crypto.
I do agree with you, but my big concern is that they only do this during the electoral year. And once they do get elected or they don't get elected and someone else does in their place, there's going to be this shift where they either don't care or they're going to expect a lot of money to be donated to their campaigns or whatever. Because I also think that last week, with what happened with Donald Trump, set the bar very high in terms of expectations for what this industry should provide to the political class in order to be left alone.
Well, it depends. I think considering the bar set high based on what Trump said, I think is Unfortunate. Once again, if you want to go down to political discussion, that's fair or not. But I don't think that bar was very high, right? That wasn't a very high bar of just, well, leave us alone, and take Gary Gensler out, because I think that likely could happen either way. And so that's a pretty low bar to set based on what he had stated. And admittedly, maybe we're just that grasping in the crypto space because the environment was so negative last year that we're just grasping for anything at this point. But if you kind of tease out his speech in Nashville and actually listen to any like hardened comments of actual policy, there wasn't much of a bar there, right? And I think the industry is just that grasping for anything. So that, in that sense, since that bar isn't that high, I think there isn't as bad of a scenario in comparison. Now, once again, I have in no way, shape, or form any interest in the left side of the party with respect to crypto, or even personally outside of crypto. I don't think that they align with my ideals at all. But I don't think there's that big of a difference. There's going to be less difference than people than people think between the two. There'll be some. It's still a net positive, for like a Trump to win, but not as big of a difference as people think. In contrast, as I've multiple times shared my support, I think there's a drastic difference if RFK wins. That is a massive difference in the way crypto and Bitcoin will be seen in the U.S.
Well, when I mentioned high expectations, I was referring to the point of view of the politician expecting to receive donations and raise funds for the campaign, as I believe the numbers regarding Trump's fundraiser add up to about 150 million, which is a lot of money and is his third biggest fundraiser ever in any industry. And maybe that it was expected to be like this, but at the same time, we also set the expectations bar pretty high. Anyway, let's talk about Edge Wallet because I do have some questions about it.
Sure.
So, is it still open source? Because someone on Twitter was very curious about this.
Yeah, it is open source. You can actually go and actually run it yourself. Go to GitHub. GitHub.com/edgeapp is the URL. You can download it. Admittedly, it is a complicated build. So I'll be the first to admit that it's not the most straightforward build for a developer to get up and running because it has many different code bases that need to come together with a very specific setup on your computer to be able to get the build working. But yes, it actually does build, and we've had people come to us and say, "Hey, I built the app. I actually want to build my own version of an app using your platform, and launch different projects and companies through that." So yes, it is still open source. Go ahead and build it yourself. Give it a try. And yeah, let us know what you think. And if you want to contribute to it, of course, that's something we're very, very open to.
That's really great because there are so many wallets in this space that are not entirely open source. Maybe that they open source the part about securing the keys, so you're sure that it does what it says it does, but they don't open source maybe the interface or something which they consider to be proprietary or something they want to protect,
Correct. Yeah. So the interface is the one that's like obviously very, very important to open source, because even if like your underlying the covers is open source, the interface could easily compromise that, right? The interface can say, well, okay, well, hey, underlying library, give me the keys, and the interface then sends that out. So it's important for the entire stack to be pretty transparent. You want to make sure that everything between what you see on screen all the way up until the app can hit the network is open source. That way you can validate that whatever the app sends off the network is nothing that is sensitive, right? So and what does the app track? What does it send off to the network versus what stays inside of the device needs to be open source. And this is the interesting part when we talk to a lot of users, even those that aren't developers, don't care about open source, is there's this unfortunate assumption in our world today that if an app has access to something, some information, some data, that the company does, and that the people of the company have access to that information. People just absolutely assume that. And that's been largely true for most apps until cryptocurrency, where cryptocurrency said, well, the app has access to private keys. Doesn't mean the company does, and doesn't mean that users do. But you'll see how much people freak out, especially in the privacy space, because the interface will let people care about privacy. And they'll go, hey, how come your app Edge requests access to this, 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 and this from within the app, right? Why photos and camera? Why contact list? And I'll be very straightforward. Like, yes, the app will, although it doesn't require it, will ask for photos, camera, contact list. Those are three of the main ones. Photos, so that you can scan a QR code, camera, right? A lot of people need to scan QR codes. You need camera access to do that. But that camera doesn't stream anything to us. We don't see anything that the camera sees, only the app. And that's a very different thing than many other apps. As well, your photos, it's so you can scan a QR code from the photo list. And that's actually a nice little feature. You take a picture of a QR code that you want to scan it later, if that's someone's public address, you can do that. But it's optional. If you disable that, then you just can't scan. Contact list is one that many people freak out about because, hey, am I streaming my contacts and all my friends over to Edge? Well, based on our open source code, which people could review and audit, you'll see that that's not true. All we're doing is allowing people to tag transactions from their contact list. So, Vlad, if you're on my contact list on my phone, and so therefore, if I were to send you money, I can type VL and it will auto-complete your name from my contact list. And then that data gets saved on my phone and encrypted. That data into clear, unencrypted, is never sent to Edge. We don't see any of that. So that's the piece I'd love to get out to your listeners, is realize that what permissions an application asks for are not necessarily permissions that the company is asking for, or it's not data that the company gets and the people within the company. But the only way to really know that is if the company is deploying an app that's open source, and so they could be proven right or wrong.
Yeah, that's really important to mention because there was someone who wrote a tweet as a reply to my announcement about our interview. And speaking of that, this is not live on Twitter right now, and it will be at one point. The reason, apparently, is that they changed the requirements for live streaming, and I have to change some settings, and I'm not going to do that in the middle of the stream.
That's fair.
It concerns their policy for Twitter Premium or whatever, X or whatever they call it. But someone also mentioned something about Monero view keys and the fact that they might be stored. View key, I guess, is the equivalent of the public key in Bitcoin. And this is another conversation that should be had because basically Edge Wallet is a light wallet. It connects to some Electrum servers or their equivalent, in the sense that you're fetching data about the state of the blockchain and about other information such as the price from third-party servers. And I know since I last interviewed you, you made some improvements. In 2018 or 2019, you already had some randomized scheme for Electrum servers so that you don't rely entirely on the infrastructure provided by Edge Wallet, which can be a point of failure. But I was wondering if you made any further improvements and if there's any sort of public key data that you collect about the users.
Got it. So Edge, the company, doesn't collect any public key data. However, some public key data might end up in our hands. So the kind of public key data that might end up in our hands is not when you just go query your transactions, right? That's the thing. As soon as you launch the app, you need to know what your transactions are, what your balances are. Those go to open APIs and nodes. So, for example, Electrum servers. We've actually switched from Electrum servers over to BlockBook servers, which are run by various different people and companies as well. Very, very similar to Electrum. They just have a better API. Trezor is the one that built the open source code for BlockBook. All right, so that's kind of one nice thing is it's a fully open source implementation that you can run on top of a node, and many of these provide a level, because we connect to these type of services and APIs. It provides a separation between the owner of a key and an account in Edge. So, like for example, a person running a BlockBook node or an API might see that, oh look, this IP address went and queried for a balance, but they don't necessarily know that that's someone in Edge. In the same sense, any nodes that we run, someone might query and say, hey, I need a balance for this address, but we don't even know that that's coming from Edge because it could be open and someone else from a different wallet could be querying it. So that type of openness allows for a disassociation between a query that comes into a server and what platform they're specifically using. So there's that nice additional addition of privacy in that regard, and that's contrast to many other self-custody apps where you are 100% relying on their infrastructure. Not only do you have to go through them, but you send things like an Xpub. And for those that don't know what an Xpub is, an Xpub, in the case of currencies like Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, right? We call those UTXO currencies, or kind of the original style of Bitcoin. An Xpub, while very efficient, you send one little piece of data. The server that you send it to can derive every address you will ever have till the end of time, right, for that wallet. In contrast to querying individual addresses, which are much more heavyweight, costly, but don't compromise the entire future of that wallet to one specific server or node. So it is a much more engineering costly thing that we do to access the open network for dozens of servers. I'm sorry, not servers, but cryptocurrencies. But that does contribute to a higher level of privacy. Is it perfect? No, in no way, shape, or form would I claim that it's perfect, but it does contribute to a higher level of privacy. You mentioned the view key of Monero. Should I go into that and what that's necessarily for?
Yeah.
I know that was asked as one of the questions on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
So the view key for Monero gives up a little bit of information that does compromise a bit of the privacy for Monero users at the trade-off of making your wallet much faster to synchronize your transactions and balances. So the problem with most privacy coins is that the transactions are very, very encrypted on the chain. So, and you don't know who's sending and who's receiving. You don't know the balances and amounts. So therefore, how do you know what transactions are yours? Right? You literally, there's a whole blockchain of encrypted transactions. You can't tell which ones are yours. And many privacy-based currencies require wallets that effectively need to stream the blockchain through an app such as Edge or a client-side wallet and have to decrypt the transactions. And if it decrypts, then it's yours. All right, it successfully decrypts with your keys, then it's yours. And then you have to do some further decryption to understand amounts, source address, destination address, things like that. But that's a very heavyweight process, and it takes a while. So giving up the view key is using a protocol API developed by actually one of the core developers of Monero. If anyone remember Ricardo Spagni or Fluffy Pony, he's been in the space for many, many, many years, although he's gone more quiet as of late. But he was one of the main faces of Monero and one of the main developers of Monero from years back in its early days. And so he formed a company called MyMonero, and they were one of the most popular wallets for Monero for a long time. And they utilized this model where it would give up a view key to a server. And with that, the server can determine which transactions are yours. And your wallet would not have to scan the blockchain. It would just say, here's my view key. Tell me what transactions are mine. Boom, you get the transaction, you calculate your balance. So what's the compromise there? Obviously the speed. And we had a lot of people that could not deal with synchronizing their Monero wallet. It just took a while. It burned up CPU on their phone, took up bandwidth, and they wanted to be able to quickly spend. And you sometimes can't do that if you don't have your wallet in sync. And they would transition over to an app like Edge. So the privacy implication of this, though, is that yes, this server knows which transactions are yours. It knows the TX IDs of which transactions are yours. As well, it knows incoming amounts, but it doesn't know who they're from, and it doesn't know amounts that you send out to. And because of the way UTXO currency works, because of the way transactions send out amounts and return change, it doesn't inherently know how much money you specifically have. So case in point example, you might send out some money to somebody and then receive change, right? That change comes into a completely different address within your wallet, and it might see those amounts, but it has no idea how much got actually sent out, and it doesn't know who those addresses that you sent money out to are, or where you received the money from. So there's enough obfuscation to achieve what I'd call about half to 2/3 of Monero's privacy, but at the trade-off of having much faster transactions. Now, one cool thing about this protocol is it does allow you to run your own kind of node. Right? I don't think that this is a mass adoptable solution, but many people do this, where they run their own Monero node with what's called an LWS, light wallet server. And that could be one that you run yourself, and you give up the view key to that node or server, and you don't give up any privacy because that's your own. And Edge does support this. You can punch in your own light wallet server URL, much like you could Electrum for Bitcoin, punch in your own Electrum server. And that view key then gets shared only with that server, and only that sees your transactions, knows which transactions are yours. And there's actually a box getting developed by the organizer of Monerotopia, or probably the Monero conference of the world, Doug Tuman. And he's developed this little box, costs like $600-700, and it will have a full Monero node as well as a light wallet server in it. And then you can connect to it yourself and have that full high level of privacy while still having a light wallet that doesn't get, burn all your bandwidth and burn your battery to synchronize. And soon there's a technology getting developed in the Monero ecosystem called view tags, which what I think are the holy grail of privacy and usability. I'm very excited about this, and I was talking to one of the Monero core developers last year at Monerotopia. And what view tags, or at least a version 2 of view tags exist today in Monero to speed up synchronization, but view tags version 2 will allow you to give up this key to a server, this tag, and the server will know which transactions are yours, but will know nothing else. It won't know the source address, destination address, or amounts, but it'll know that there's a transaction and it has something to do with this tag in some way, shape, or form. To me, that's the holy grail. It would be amazing to have that functionality, because then we give up just about no privacy. We get the 90 to 99% of the privacy, but with 100% of the usability in comparison to other cryptocurrencies.
I want to ask you about what's the difference between a full node and this Electrum or any other type of indexing type of server. But before we get to that, I have to talk about today's sponsor, who is Sideshift.ai. It's basically a competitor of what Edge Wallet is trying to do, but I guess you can
Not at
also
all.
integrate
Sideshift is
Sideshift.
integrated. They were one of our earliest integrators. I've known Andreas Brecken for years. Hats off to Andreas. Thanks for sponsoring this podcast. Good job. No, we've integrated Sideshift very early on, and great service. So I don't foresee them as a competitor. Maybe they've got a wallet as well, but I think they've got good stuff going on in the back end for the swap functionality.
Yeah, I think they also have a wallet now, but it's optional. You don't have to use that. You don't have to buy their token. Basically, the way in which I tell my listeners to use Sideshift is if someone offers to pay you in stable coins and they don't want to negotiate on some free market, actually free money, then you can use Sideshift and you swap it without signing up, without any other requirements. You just go to sideshift.ai, you send the CBDC wannabe, which is the stable coin, and then you get some sound money or whatever you want to get. You can even get Geo Boden if you're into meme coins.
Yeah, exactly. They do support quite a bit of coins. And so, yeah, definitely go check out Sideshift.ai, or even check it out inside of Edge. You can even prefer it. So one thing we do in Edge, you can actually, of the many different services, you can say, I prefer this specific one. And if you like Sideshift, you can say, I prefer Sideshift. So that allows Sideshift to be the primary swap exchange. And all of your swaps, if Sideshift can support it, will use Sideshift. If it can't support it for whatever reason, like geographic restriction, or they don't have that asset, then it will fall back to one of the other options in our app. So we definitely have pretty rich support, and Sideshift is a good part of that.
Right, so on the topic of Electrum server versus full node, how would you describe the difference, and why can't you just point your full Bitcoin Core node or something to Edge Wallet or any other light wallet to get the indexing?
Yes, this goes down a description that might be a bit like computer science specific, but I'll try to describe it for the layman. If you think about blockchains in general, right? They are literally a chain of blocks. And with each block, you have a bundle of transactions inside of that block. All right. And so that's not that is the data model of a blockchain, right? Here's a block. It's got a bunch of transactions and hashes, that prove this block is valid, and then effectively a link to another block. And each block has a block number: block 0, block 1, block 2, block 3, block 4. And what a full node is doing is it's got a stream of blocks going into it from other nodes, and then it's sorting and putting them together, verifying that they're valid, and writing them to disk. A full node has a very poor language by which you can ask it for information. So a full node can easily give you a block. So you say, hey, full node, I would like block 500,000. Great, it spits out block 500,000. However, a light wallet isn't necessarily interested in getting a block. A light wallet is interested in getting transactions in what are called UTXOs for a specific address. So if you have a specific address inside your wallet, and sometimes you have several addresses, what you really want is the ability to say, hey, these addresses, I want to see the transactions from those addresses, and I want to see UTXOs. And what UTXOs are really kind of like the balance or the transactions in an address that have not yet been spent. All right, like money that got received into an address that has not yet been spent. I want to get a list of all of those monies, those bills in a way, into the cash register that have not yet been spent. And full nodes don't necessarily have that as a language that you can ask it for. So what is like an Electrum or a BlockBook or an indexing server is effectively one that takes the entire blockchain and then it puts it into a database such that you can ask it questions that are more relevant to a light wallet, such as, here's an address, please give me my balance. Here's an address, please give me my transactions. Here's an address, please give me my unspent money, like, the money that hasn't been spent. And it lets you do this in ways that are very friendly, such as through paging. So imagine a person has like 5,000 transactions on an address. You don't want to ask it, hey, give me the transactions for this address, and get 5,000 transactions back all at once on an internet connection, in the middle of Africa, with a very, very small, low bandwidth device. So typically in computers, what they do is they stream it and they get chunks of it. They say, okay, give me the first 50 transactions. You download that, then you process it. Give me the next 50. Otherwise, you get 5,000. It might take so long to get it that the connection would just drop, right? That's called a timeout. It takes too long to service that large request. So chunking it into smaller amounts as well, it gives you the language of saying, hey, you know something? I have all of my transactions up to block 500,000. Can you please give me the transactions for this address after block 500,000? Right? Because that way I'm not getting all of the ones that I already have saved on the phone. Just give me the more recent ones. Some APIs say, give me all the transactions after, June 1st, 2014. You can give a timestamp. So all of these methods of querying the blockchain are what are missing from a full node and what are available on these kind of super nodes or super indexing nodes, such as, once again, Electrum or BlockBook, and a few other different options in the ecosystem. And that's their necessity. Otherwise, you would have a very, very, very heavyweight wallet that is very impactful on the performance and the resources of your phone when it wants to simply know what money you have and what transactions you have.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful description and definition of how it's different, because people expect when they run the node on their computer to be able to use a mobile wallet with that. But that's not really how it works. You have to add something on top of it for this indexing feature.
Yeah. In the days of Bitcoin only, there were many wallets that could access a full node. And I think that was much more feasible. And I think it might still somewhat feasible for people that have a limited number of wallets and currencies. If you're just a Bitcoin maxi and all I want is Bitcoin, I've got my one Bitcoin wallet with my one seed phrase sitting inside of my phone, and uh, the functionality that that app is capable of is just that, then yeah, it can point to a node. It can deal with syncing blocks, looking for your transactions. And It's not going to be the fastest thing, but it'll work, and it could potentially be usable enough for someone that doesn't really use Bitcoin on a very regular basis. But from the viewpoint of an app that deals with many different chains, imagine Bitcoin, Litecoin, Doge, BCH, you name it, having to do that across multiple different addresses and keys and assets is too impactful to the app to be a very usable experience. And that's the decision you just have to make. And one of the beauties of the cryptocurrency space, unlike the banking system, is that apps can be drastically different from each other and appeal to different people and different use cases. I challenge anyone to tell me what's the drastic difference between their checking account with Wells Fargo and Chase, or a like a small credit union or local credit union. By and large, that account feels probably the same. You could direct deposit into it. You can write checks if you still do that anymore. You can have a debit card against it. But by and large, it feels pretty much the same. In the cryptocurrency world, because it's just software, we don't deal with all the regulation necessary to be able to say, oh, we just wanted to play some software that people can use. We can actually make products that are notably different. And with that comes the options. And so people have the option of running these single chain, connect to your own node, type of application, not have to running an Electrum server. You could do that if you wanted to. And the goal of products and companies like Edge are to find their user base, and which hopefully is a large user base, right, that wants that specific type of product.
Yes, I must also mention that this podcast is sponsored by StarkWare, and their implementation of Starks, which is called StarkNet, can come to Bitcoin if we activate Opcat. So basically, their message to the listeners is consider Opcat as an option for the next Bitcoin soft fork, because you can get a lot of cool stuff with it. You can get scalable transactions, you can get pretty good privacy with ZK proofs, and you can also do something very interesting with syncing full nodes. So basically, instead of downloading blocks or instead of accessing somebody else's server, you can verify against a ZK proof, and you're going to have a pretty good and privacy-friendly way of having your mobile wallet within a few seconds. So
yeah, very cool. I know that's in the L2 space of Bitcoin with a lot of the zero knowledge rollups and proofs, which I'm excited about. I actually hope that movement helps provide Bitcoin with a lot of what it's been missing over the past decade.
yeah, it seems like ZK rollups are very fashionable, and they seem to be competing somewhat with sidechains. And I was wondering, do you still think we're gonna get proper sidechains, or is the attention focusing toward ZK rollup? What's your
Attention is
perspective?
definitely, I mean, the attention is definitely focusing on ZK rollup. And to me, sidechains weren't that bad when they were implemented as far back as like rootstock. I mean, the main thing that made them not so, I guess the main thing that made it arguable that, oh, we shouldn't be using sidechains back in the era of rootstock, what is it, like 2017, 16, maybe even 15 when rootstock was first announced, was the fact that you had a federated group of nodes that could peg in and peg out these coins. We've figured out better ways of doing that now, even without ZK rollups. So many people would not in any way, shape, or form call Thorchain a sidechain, right? Like, name anyone that's called Thorchain a sidechain. No one has. But if you think about the technology that builds Thorchain, instead of you having a federated set of 15-ish nodes that can determine when you peg in Bitcoin and mint a, what is it, RBTC, right? Smart Bitcoin on rootstock. Now you have 40 to 80 nodes which rotate their keys, randomly choosing nodes and changing the nodes every week to lock Bitcoin that then mints a synthetic Bitcoin inside a Thorchain, which can then be traded. So in a way, Thorchain is very, very similar to a sidechain, except that it's a sidechain for half a dozen different chains. So Bitcoin, Litecoin, BCH, Doge, Ethereum, AVAX. It basically is a single sidechain for many different chains. And the rotating key technology that they've used is orders of magnitude better than what we had back in 2015 in kind of like the rootstock era. But it hasn't been adopted to a like Bitcoin L2 yet. I've been trying to scope out what people are doing in the Bitcoin L2 space with sidechains and zk rollups, but fundamentally, I think that is a fairly hardened model that could compete against rollups, depending on what the complexity of the rollups are, the cost of the rollups, because this is from what I can tell, a far cheaper way of getting Bitcoin into another chain versus the rollups. The rollups are a more trustless way to do it, but this one's, I'd say, pretty darn good with 40 to 80 different nodes rotating randomly, where you don't know if you're going to be a node that holds keys. So which one will work? I don't know. But I'm very excited about the fact that we've got this better technology for quote unquote side chains, L2s, whatever you want to call it. And fundamentally, I think something will work, and Bitcoin will finally have that functionality that's been missing for the decade, and it's relegated that functionality to other chains such as Ethereum, Solana, and whatnot.
Yeah, I like to say this a lot, that everything that's being built on other chains right now was first proposed for Bitcoin and in some way was supposed to happen on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is market demand for it only proves that it should have happened somehow. But we never really got the sidechains we were promised back in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
This show, in a way, is very aspirational because it's sponsored by StarkWare, which is trying to build this ZK rollup, but it's also sponsored by Layer 2 Labs, who are trying to
Like,
do this drive chain, which is a
yeah, Paul
miner-centric
Schwartz.
sidechain. Yeah, Paul is very active these days, and he's trying to push this idea. And it doesn't seem like he's getting too much. How should I put it? Like I know a bunch of people like Peter Todd, and they think it's never going anywhere and it makes no sense because it gives too much political power to the miners. But I still think it's worth it for the simple reason that it can integrate pretty much every use case. I think it's wrongly being discussed as a block size increase without the hard fork. It's much more than that because you can create a sidechain for every possible use case. And these sidechains are also paying fees to the miners. And I think this topic of how we're going to pay the miners when the subsidy keeps decreasing every 4 years
Exactly.
is not discussed seriously yet.
No, it hasn't, especially between the maxis that like the Uber maxis that don't want side chains, they don't want rollups. They only think Lightning and that's it. They're the ones that definitely aren't considering this challenging fact that we do need a security budget for Bitcoin. And how do you get that security budget? Where does the money come from? That definitely is one big challenge that hasn't been discussed well enough. And I think we're seeing some of the ramifications of that already in this time period, in the sense that, hey, will Bitcoin keep going up in price enough to keep miners compensated fairly if the transaction volume drops? And the volume has dropped and moved off onto other chains, right? We've definitely seen that. And so what transactions are left effectively, and the blocks that are being rewarded, that the raw block reward needs to compensate for that. And we've been pretty flat price after the initial bump this year, but blocks have every 4 years, and if Bitcoin doesn't at least double every 4 years, then we have effectively a net downward security budget in Bitcoin, right? So that is a concern, I think, that needs to get addressed, and that needs to be compensated for. Otherwise, Bitcoin won't be secure enough to hold its total value.
Well, I did have this conversation on Twitter a few days ago, and the other person was basically saying, why do we need to save the miners? Just let them go bankrupt and shut down their operations. We don't need mining pools because we have, I'm not sure if you know what a BitX is. It's basically this tiny ASIC that you can run at home. And there's also the nerd miner. And this person was claiming that we can secure the Bitcoin network only with these small devices for home, which I think is pretty funny.
Well, let's take that argument and try to play that out, right? Yeah, let's shut down. And don't get me wrong, I'd be much happier with millions of people around the world running little ASIC miners at home and replacing the big behemoth miners that are only like half a dozen around the world. But play that out in the sense that if you purchase one of these devices, these little tiny ASIC miners, and you run them at home, at the end of the day, though, that still needs to be profitable, right? It still needs to be profitable. If the big miners can't be profitable because you're not generating enough both transaction fees and mining rewards, yet those big miners have economies of scale, meaning that they have access to very cheap ASICs and they have access to cheap energy, but they can't be profitable because of the mining reward. Why would an individual miner be profitable when an individual miner will most likely have higher cost electricity? They can't negotiate and be where the electricity is cheap. Like the big story about Bitcoin being very green in its energy is mandated on being able to move miners where energy is cheap or being thrown away, such as gas flaring, right? So an individual miner can't go in, hey, I'm going to go put my little ASIC miner right next to, this oil drilling station, which is going to gas flare. I can't do that, right? And so I'm only going to be able to access pretty much full priced, consumer ready, convenient electricity. So that's going to cost me more for sure. And so what would make me think that I'm going to be able to be more profitable than the other miners? And if I'm not going to be profitable, why am I going to operate? And so in essence, you effectively drop the amount of hash power and dollar value that goes into the network, which does effectively drop the security budget. So like, I'm not going to say someone's silly and crazy without trying to argue why I think that idea just can't really pan out. But I'm open to hear, a rebuttal to what I just said, which is, yeah, it's hard to be profitable as an individual miner in comparison to the large economies of scale miners. And you're both needing to be profitable in order to be sustainable for that security budget of Bitcoin.
Well, I believe there's a case to be made for ideological mining, or mining as a way to reward the rest of the network for the fact that you already got rich. I guess there are a bunch of people who mine just for the sake of it and not because they expect some sort of rewards. They think of mining more like a lottery ticket as opposed to something that's going to provide to them regular payouts. But that's a very small, insignificant
Very small.
percentage of the hash rate.
Right. And how much hash rate would Bitcoin have if those are the miners we're reliant on? And if you think about the original elegance and beauty of Bitcoin, this I heard a lot back in 2013 when I first started talking about Bitcoin, is one of the most elegant things about its design and architecture is that it is specifically relying on people's rational selfishness, right? If you are selfish and all you care about is money going to you, you'll behave well and the network will thrive. We've inverted that if we're relying on ideological miners that mine at a loss. Now you're completely inverting what was so elegantly beautiful about Bitcoin, was that you're not going to attack the network so long as you're simply rational and selfish. So I don't fundamentally think that the ecosystem can thrive on fully just ideological miners. And so hence, I think that that problem of fees going to the miners does need to get resolved.
I did also record this other side of the extreme, which is about adding tail emission to Bitcoin. Peter Todd is championing the idea. I've also heard a bunch of developers who don't think it's a bad idea because, in principle, it's what's going to keep the miners going. And it's pretty naive to believe that users are going to be transacting on a more regular basis just to pay more fees and therefore pay for the security of the network. So in some ways, it is the sort of design that's going to work, but it's also a breach in the social contract because people signed up for 21 million Bitcoin and this plan for currency inflation up to 2,140 the year. So what do you think about this whole idea that there should be demurrage or tail emission?
I've never been against the tail emission in general, which is why I think other cryptocurrencies that have it, I have no problem with, like such as Ethereum. I fundamentally don't think it's going to happen because Bitcoin's a religion, and that's breaking the religion. And I also find it ironic that the same people that said it is insanely dangerous to hard fork, blah, 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 like cannot hard fork for hard fork's sake, are saying, yes, we should add tail emission, which likely they're going to promote that through a hard fork. Although, ironically, you can do that with a soft fork. People think hard fork is dangerous because you want to make sure you're running the same thing. And you can do insanely dangerous things with a soft fork and completely change the social contract with a soft fork, and people don't realize how it's just you have much messier code, right? The soft fork code is much messier. But I just don't think it'll happen because of, like you said, the social contract, and so many people have created that that narrative around it's too dangerous to hard fork, that I don't think that'll happen. However, what I do think can realistically happen is we kill off the L1 via an L2. The hard part is you need kind of a consensus around which L2 it would be. So if you think about it, the L2s are, at least the ones that are getting the most visibility and traction, are designed to fund the validators of the L2 through transaction fees, and that's it. Just transaction fees, because an L2 cannot mine, right? It cannot create new coins. It cannot have inflation. It only can fund validators through transaction fees. But granted, most of the validators will likely be proof of stake, right? Not proof of work. Um, it will at least be lower cost for them to operate a validator. So play this out, right? You've got an L2. Say you have like the L2, whichever one it is. Maybe it's Botanix's, or Alpin Labs build something, or StarkWare, and it's because Bitcoin L1 and Lightning by and large are not usable for transactions at scale. And we're 10 years down the line and people are actually using Bitcoin. All the transaction fees are now being accumulated by the L2. It's making all of the revenue, right? And the L1 really isn't making a lot of the revenue anymore. You've pegged your Bitcoin into the L2, and the L2's got all the transactions, especially if it's not a ZK rollup, right? Instead, it's more like a Thor chain where there's simply this gigantic multisig of 40 to 80 nodes. So it's not really contributing anything back to the L1 with respect to fees. And even if it was, they could hard fork it and stop it from doing that. At some point in time, once you've pegged your Bitcoin into an L2, and that's where all the economic activity is, why would you ever peg it back to the L1 in the first place? And the only thing that the L1 is doing is it's creating new coins, which are then just getting pegged into the L2 to actually do stuff, to make payments, to collateralize into a smart contract, to take out a loan, to earn yield, to stake, you know, everything that you kind of want to do in cryptocurrency. And as the emission on the L1 starts going down and down and down and down, and potentially zero, so 100 years from now, the L1 effectively just dies. And that's okay because Bitcoin still continues on, and it continues on in the life of as an L2, as a full proof of stake, and maybe you can still fold in proof of work, but on a different chain that is actually gaining all of the security budget through transaction fees. And the L1 effectively goes away. That I actually could foresee happening, and I I'm not sure what would necessarily definitively prevent that. Like, there's nothing that I could foresee definitively preventing that, other than, well, there's some people that just hodl on, and that's all they want to do is keep their money on the L1 for like religion's sake.
I think you just made the best case for drive chains I've ever heard. Basically,
Drive
unless
chains are, yeah.
we want the L1 to die because of these L2s that are selfish and collect fees for themselves without giving anything back, we do want something that will pay the miners. But there's also the case to be made
But then
about
why?
the L1 being able to destroy the L2s, right?
There's ways that the L1s can try to destroy the L2s, but they need to do that by effectively changing the protocol to make the L2s non-feasible, right? Really, it's like, how do you actually make the L2? Because the L2s operate where the L1s don't know that they're necessarily feeding into an L2, like multisig, right? The simple concept of multisig is what enables there to be an L2. Now, the bigger the multisig, the better the security of the pegged coins in Bitcoin to then create an L2. And we already have threshold signatures. That's what Thorchain uses, which now allows us to have an infinite amount of multisig that just is only hindered by the amount of bandwidth to chat between all the different nodes that hold this multisig of pool of L1 Bitcoin. So we already have that. So what would the L1s do? Would it remove multisig? Would it remove threshold signatures? Oh, by the way, threshold signatures are at the cryptography level, not at the protocol level. So while the protocol supports Taproot, Taproot does allow for threshold signatures, and they're far more efficient. Do we think we're going to roll back Taproot? Even without Taproot, we can do threshold signatures with a standard base Bitcoin one address, like old school Bitcoin one address. We've now opened up the possibility through very novel cryptography to be able to have 80 cosigners on a gigantic multi-sig threshold signature, and the only thing that the Bitcoin miners and nodes see is a single key transaction. That's all it sees. So what are you going to do, L1, to try to prevent an L2? Like, tell me, what are you going to do? I don't actually know what you can do.
I mean, in some ways that's beautiful, but in other ways it's concerning. The
It's
fact that
concerning if you think that there is some actual long-term need for the L1. Like, really ask yourself that question. What is that long-term need for the L1? If you have the L2 that has all of the security budget, because that's where all the transactions are. That's where all the fees are. Do you actually want to keep the L1 with a very minimal security budget? It would be more dangerous to keep your money there. That's the interesting question. Like, what is this? And this is a very far-reaching idea, right? And philosophy and thought. But if you play it out, really ask yourself that, right? Why are we latching on to the existence of this original L1 in the long term? This is very, very far out in the future, right? 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years into the future. Most of us are dead. What is that purpose of the L1 at that point?
that is a pretty good question. If you're listening to this, you can leave a comment or comment on the chat because we're live on YouTube and let us know where you see the future of Bitcoin in the far future. If you think DL1 is going to survive and we're gonna have proof of work mining until the end of time, or there's gonna be this situation where basically it's what the Ethereum influencers were saying, right? That Ethereum can basically sustain Bitcoin and have BTC as the currency with a 21 million supply cap, and you can transact it on top of the Ethereum chain.
Well, yeah, in a way, Ethereum has become an L2 for Bitcoin. I think there's more wrapped Bitcoin than there is Bitcoin on the Lightning Network. And so, I mean, even people that promoted the Lightning Network said, oh, this can work because we'll just put all our Bitcoin on Lightning and never have to use the L1. Well, they're basically promoting what I just said, except that I think fundamentally the rollup and threshold signature EVM L2s have much better functionality and a much easier ability to stay on the L2. Whereas Lightning, you run into a few corner cases, oh, boom, I need the L1 again. Right. So even the people that say, oh, we'll just stay on Lightning, right, we'll never have to go on the L1, while they are promoting this exact narrative that I just mentioned, the technology for Lightning is much harder to use and stay on the L2. It's too easy to trip over and go, oh, I need the L1 again because I got to rebalance and blah, blah, blah. Like you'll need the L1 much more frequently. And you need the L1 to have much better skill just to onboard people onto Lightning. Whereas a gigantic transaction from a whale from L1 to an EVM L2, ZK rollup, drive chains L2, that can now onboard a lot of people directly on the L2, right? They just simply buy L2 Bitcoin. They never touch the L1. In contrast, in Lightning Network, you still have to have the keys for the L1 and you have to have funds on the L1. You can't just go directly into Lightning, otherwise you wouldn't be able to settle your transaction and have the security necessary. So fun, interesting conversation. I'll probably fold this into the discussion I have with one of the Bitcoiners local here in San Diego and next week's discussion and debate.
It is fun to think about this, and it is also fun to think outside the box because you're gonna make assumptions about what this is gonna look like. But once you ask yourself, is it always going to be this way, or will people figure out different ways to preserve this, maybe on a different L1? And that's gonna blow your mind once you realize it. But then again, people make the case for the security of the L1 and the fact that there is some actual thermodynamic security that prevents transactions from being reverted. In the case of proof of stake, it's basically politics that replaces the idea of thermodynamics.
I don't think it's politics. There is some aspect of politics. There's politics and mining too, in proof of work mining. I think there's trade-offs. I'd love to see a hybrid of the two inside of an L2, where validators have to provide some level of proof of work and also have to do some level of proof of stake. To go down that proof of work versus proof of stake debate, at the end of the day, they're both proof of value. Right, that's really it. At the end of the day, you're providing proof of value that you're willing to risk losing if you validate a wrong transaction. In the case of proof of work, that value is electricity, real estate, ASICs, some aspect of manpower that manages all of that. That's the value you're providing, and you're proving that you're providing that value, and you will lose that value in the sense that 10 minutes worth of wasted hashing, right, if you go and put in an invalid transaction, right, into your block. On the validator side, it's value pegged into a cryptocurrency, right? And there's a trade-off there, but it is a cryptocurrency that has value. So like Ethereum clearly has value as a cryptocurrency, and you are saying, I'm risking losing this value if I validate an invalid transaction and I put that into my block, then I will get slashed some amount of that value. Now the mechanisms and the incentives of how you compromise the network, in that sense, are different between the two. But I think they're more similar than people realize, especially the maxis on both sides, right? Like there are maxis on both sides, and they don't realize how similar they really are. But with some nuance, and I freely do accept that there are notable trade-offs with each one. And neither to me is the perfect world. And the closest I think we can get is folding some level of the benefits of each one. Yeah, people, I think, really open your minds in general, the audience, to realize that they're in some ways very similar, and each has their trade-offs.
Yes. And I do think we should get into a conversation about privacy, because it's been about 1 hour since we started this interview, and we still haven't talked much about a topic which is so important and which maybe doesn't get enough attention, especially, I don't know exactly why, but during the previous bull market, everything has been terrible for privacy coins. Monero, Zcash, Grin,
price-wise,
price-wise,
you're
yes.
right. Yeah, I think price-wise, you're right.
There was all of this DeFi, there was all of this meme coin and NFT and whatever action happening, but there wasn't much happening for these privacy coins. They were under the radar.
Yeah. My theory, if you look at the different bull market cycles, so there was the bull market 2013, there were no privacy coins back then, right? Bull market of 2017 is just when the privacy coins did their best, right? And then the bull markets of 2021, and then what hopefully is the bull market right now going into 2025, and look at the different narratives of those different bull markets. Like in 2017, we were just coming off privacy coins even being invented. Like we hadn't seen privacy coins until then, and so fundamentally, it was still a narrative. We were just coming off the narrative of actually trying to make Bitcoin transactable, right? We wanted to actually use Bitcoin. Like there were merchants that were accepting Bitcoin. It wasn't until like the 16, 17 era where we started seeing that drop off, or the merchants that were taking Bitcoin stopped taking Bitcoin. But we were still riding off that narrative, right? Spend Bitcoin, use Bitcoin, earn Bitcoin. Going into the narrative of 2021, it was heavily about early on in the first half, DeFi. It's I'm going to earn yield, earn yield, earn yield, earn yield. And then NFTs, I'm going to earn on these NFTs, trade these NFTs, and you know what I mean? Show that I own an NFT, be proud that I own an NFT. Here's my .eth address, and look how many NFTs I have on my .eth address. The polar opposite of privacy. So the narrative's completely shifted as to how people value cryptocurrency. Going into this cycle now, what even created a lot of the boom? An ETF, right? That's the only reason we broke all-time highs almost like half a year earlier than we normally would have in the cycle. Normally in a cycle, we hit all-time highs or break all-time highs anywhere between, I think, now to end of the year. But we broke all-time highs in, I think, March, April, far earlier than we would have. Now, many argue that we didn't actually break all-time highs, inflation adjusted. You're right, but pure raw dollar value, we've just barely nicked it, and that's unheard of in our normal cycles. But an ETF launch at the beginning of the year clearly had something to do with that, which absolutely has no direct correlation to privacy. So one could say, like, oh, privacy coins and they took a big hit, and there's government and regulation, but I think it's just the narrative shifted from payments and utility to number go up, NFTs, random DeFi, degen protocols, and whatnot, many of which don't really have a narrative around privacy. But once you go into payments, you really do, right? You really want and desire a much higher level of privacy. And to this day, I think where the privacy coins are vastly used is in the payment space. I went to PorkFest. Everybody there at PorkFest, which is a very libertarian focused event, was paying with Monero. And that could be, I mean, there's nothing illicit. They were like selling some hamburgers, so I bought some silver with, a little bit of Monero. So, I mean, it's a transactional use case, I think privacy is. Now it can fold into DeFi, but much harder, to fold into DeFi. And so I think that's where they've lost a lot of the mind share. But once we get into the transactional use case again, I think the need for privacy and the desire for privacy and once again, the price market cap of the privacy protocols will skyrocket. We're just not there.
Well, I do like the sound of it. And speaking of privacy networks, there was a comment on Twitter that I got from the social media manager of a project that's called Zeno, and they were asking
Zano, I think. Zano, I think, right?
Zeno, yeah,
Zano. How do they
Zeno,
pronounce that? Zano, Zano.
Zano. And they were asking if you're going to list them. And I think what they do basically, I mean, add them to Edge Wallet, not list them because you're not an exchange.
Not
But
exchange.
I think what they do is that they do tokens in a private way with some crypto node privacy.
So privacy coins are very hard for us to add to Edge. And I think we have more than any other app on the market. We've got 3 privacy coins, all of which have been an insane amount of engineering effort. So Monero, Zcash, and Pirate Chain. Pirate Chain being a more direct fork of Zcash. And while we thought that would be easy because it's a direct fork, it ended up being one of the hardest ones. So Zano, we are interested in supporting more privacy coins, and this chain has definitely come across my plate numerous times. We do want to evaluate them first. There's a few chains that came across our radar, and in the evaluation of its actual level of privacy, we deemed that they didn't live up to the marketing, right? And so the effort involved to put in a privacy chain is so high that we want to make sure that the chain lives up to at least what it's marketing. And so I don't believe that Zeno is not living up to the marketing, but I also just need to kind of evaluate it. And then as well to the Zano developers, one of the key things is we need tooling. We need software development kits, nodes, super nodes, and whatnot to make that integration a little bit easier. Like we can't write the raw protocol. At least we just don't have the manpower and bandwidth and expertise to write the raw cryptographic protocol for integration. But I'm assuming there are some SDKs, but it does take some time to evaluate that for actual integration. And then as well, like you said, will we list them? But it's not listing, or not exchange. In many ways, we are. So one of the most important things for us, because we are trying to replace the centralized exchange equivalents, one of the most important things for us is that we support coins that are supported through either decentralized exchanges or CeFi exchanges, like Sideshift AI. That way, it's not that someone now can just store a coin inside Edge. They can actually acquire it, send, receive it, and then also buy and sell it, trade it for other assets. So that's usually how we launch an asset. with full listing support, not just being able to hold and send and receive.
I guess they got a much longer response than they expected.
Hopefully, I don't know. I'm not sure what they expected. But the decision to list the coin is very multifaceted. So I think it can't be a short response unless we've already laid down the hammer and said no to something. Otherwise, yeah, it's a fairly lengthy one. But hopefully that length triggers what might be necessary on their side to help us with getting support.
The last time we did one of these calls, we did a pretty nice breakdown of the various layers of privacy and what
Yeah,
it's about and what type of privacy you should expect. Because when you say that you have a privacy coin or you enjoy privacy, some people have the wrong expectations. When people do coin joins on Bitcoin, they also have the wrong expectations from it. Most of the times, according
yeah,
to my Twitter interactions, they say, oh, it's just like Monero because that one also mixes your coins. But there is no confidentiality, there is no way to hide the amounts. At best, you're
right,
gonna have some privacy when you transact out of the coin join, but if you're going to consolidate the funds, you're going to mess up the entire setup and basically point to any blockchain analysis that it's the same amount of coins that was sent into this mixer and outside of it. So
exactly.
it's very nuanced, but I think you are one of the best people to define it. In years of me doing interviews, I don't think anyone made such a clear and concise breakdown of the various types of privacy.
Yeah, privacy is tough. I think I could probably, if I had to create an outline for privacy technology specifically for cryptocurrency, I say there's about 4 layers, 3 primary, and then a fourth, which you can kind of apply depending on your software, your wallet, whatnot. The 3 primary would be privacy for the sender, privacy for the recipient, and then privacy for the amounts, right? And CoinJoin gives you privacy for the sender, right? In the sense that you are sending your funds into this mixer, and when they come out, people ideally cannot tell where the original source of the funds come from. So when they come out, they can go to someone else. And so that person, though, doesn't achieve a high level of privacy because if their addresses are doxed, it would be clear that that recipient received X amount of Bitcoin into their addresses. Right. So the recipient has no privacy from a coin join. The sender does get some privacy, right? There's a new technology. Well, not new. This is actually very, very old. Old technology called stealth addresses, which I was aware of back in 2013, having worked closely with Amir Taki from Dark Wallet. Our team had worked with him, and so we were interested in adding stealth addresses. Stealth addresses give you the opposite side privacy, meaning recipient privacy. So you are sending your Bitcoin to a stealth address, which actually is not so much an address that Bitcoin sees. It's a way for you to derive an address from a stealth address, a real Bitcoin address from a stealth address, and send money to it. Um, However, because a recipient publishes the stealth address, they don't publish the individual addresses that you can create. No one can associate the individual addresses to the recipient other than the sender. Right? The sender sends to an individual one, but if I wore my stealth address on my hat or I put it on my website, you can't tell how much money that address ever received because you don't see the actual real individual Bitcoin addresses. Um, so that provides recipient privacy. And to the credit of one of the Bitcoin core developers, I think it was Greg Maxwell, um, the development of confidential transactions effectively shields the amounts, right? Like when I send a transaction, how much was sent out, how much was received, and those amounts are effectively encrypted. So confidential transactions are kind of like that third piece of privacy, such that um, even though I might be able to see that someone received a certain amount of received money, and I can see the address is associated to so and so, I don't see how much they effectively received. So these are the 3 key technologies that are used in all of the true privacy coins. So Monero, Zcash, Pirate Chain. I'm going to presume Zano uses these 3 as well. If it's missing any one of those, you have a major gaping hole. And I think one of the problems with Bitcoin is that it has individually promoted just nuggets of these technologies. So stealth addresses, like I say, those are developed back in 2013. Now, today, there's a strong push to integrate um, secret payments, I think it's called, I think it's called secret payments. The nomenclature skips me, but those are basically stealth addresses. They're rehashing an old technology, maybe a few tweaks, maybe make the cryptography a little bit better. But at the end of the day, it provides privacy for the recipient, and that's it. And does not provide any of the amount of privacy, and it doesn't provide any of the sender privacy. And if you look at all the efforts to de-anonymize a lot of the privacy-based coins and claims that they're able to de-anonymize it under these very specific cases, in the case of secret payments on Bitcoin, you're a gaping hole. You've only got like barely 1/3 of the privacy. They can de-anonymize that at the snap of a finger. So I think it's a false sense of privacy you're getting with these partial solutions that I think is a bit risky, especially for the effort involved, especially secret payments. So the problem with secret payments is that it provides only 1/3 of the privacy, but it provides 100% of the user experience challenge of privacy coins. And when I say that user experience challenge, I'm talking about having to know what transactions are yours. Remember how we said, like in Monero, giving up the view key allows you to determine which transactions are yours on a server, and that server can send back your transactions. But because of all the other technology, such as the confidential transactions and the tumbling and mixing, that server doesn't know much else, right? It doesn't give up all of the privacy. In the case of secret payments, you still have that problem is you have to find your transaction. So without giving, if you give up your view key, then you're basically back to regular Bitcoin, right? Because you have nothing else protecting the transaction. And then if you don't give up the view key in secret payments, you're having to stream the blockchain again and scan all the blocks, try to decrypt them for the transactions that are yours. And at scale, that just doesn't work. So you've got that one major user experience hurdle that Monero and Zcash have, but you've only got 1/3 of the privacy. So it's like all of the detriment in user experience with only 1/3 of the benefit. It, to me, it doesn't feel like a big enough win for the effort involved, you know. And then just to complete what I said earlier, I said there's about 4 layers. The 4th layer is IP address privacy, and that's using things like VPNs and Tor, or a combination of the two of them. And that can be applied across the board on any protocol. And it just is a trade-off of bandwidth and how fast your network is and how fast you can synchronize, and the operating system you're on, if it supports it or not, and the network that you're on. But that provides network level privacy so that your IP address, which is associated to your ISP, can't be associated with connecting to a node that is a Zcash node or a Monero node, you know, or a Xano node, to then disassociate that you're even transacting in a privacy coin at all. So those are things that I think are the multifaceted layers. And generally speaking, I definitely promote the use of the full privacy coins. I wish Bitcoin would have that, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because I guess the conversation within the Bitcoin maximalist circles was always that Bitcoin is going to become private at one point, but we're just waiting for the kind of proposal that scales. Because that was the other conversation, that confidential transactions are large in size, ring signatures are even larger. And if you're going to add that on top of Bitcoin, you're only going to make it less usable. So there were some proposals. I think right now Halo 2 on Zcash is the most scalable privacy protocol out there. And I do like what they did, because basically within that mixing pool that they generate, they can have transaction sizes which are approximately around the same size as the average SegWit transaction on Bitcoin, which is still a major breakthrough, as this was always considered to be more block space intensive. And there's also MimbleWimble, which I think was discarded after they figured out how to exploit it, how to basically listen to transactions in the middle to bypass that pruning. But I do like what they did in Litecoin. I'm not sure if you paid attention to that. There is
MWeb
the MWeb
implementation.
MimbleWimble extension block. It's basically a block size increase, which also adds privacy on top. And this extension block acts like a sidechain, meaning that the same miners are securing it and collecting fees for it. And it does have confidential transactions. So
Right.
it has sender and receiver privacy, but also I guess this is the most important part. You cannot see the amounts being sent. You can only see how much coins are locked on inside of this layer. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you played with that, or if you think it's interesting, or if there's anything that you discovered and you think is much better suited for Bitcoin.
Suited for Bitcoin, I think the big challenge is that Bitcoin is just so hardened and not interested in changing its core layer one protocol, and everything will end up having to be a quote unquote sidechain or another chain. Which one it is, I haven't made any stake claim. Like Zcash, I think is the leading team developing the best technology. So a Zcash technology sidechain or L2 could be one that actually does get a lot of the transaction volume adoption. So if we were to have two L2s for Bitcoin that succeed, I imagine one could be the privacy layer and the other one could be the EVM smart contract DeFi layer. I can imagine that happening. From the viewpoint of MWeb, I wrote it off a long time ago until Litecoin. And the main reason I wrote it off is the user experience of MWeb was very chatty. And so people are like, well, what does that mean, chatty, Paul? Well, chatty means that you can't just publish an address and someone send money to it. Instead, you had to, similar to Lightning, um, publish something that amounts to an address, but then you need to actually send off-chain transaction information between the sender and the recipient, which then eventually gets published on chain. So you needed a side channel of communication. And all of the MimbleWimble implementations couldn't get a standard for what that side channel communication would be. Because if you think about it, that communication is free communication that you're not paying for. So what was the method? I literally remember the developer saying, "Oh, it's simply just email this file." Like, are you kidding me? I want to send money. I got to email. Oh, you can send it over SMS. We're like, what? Like, this is not a real user experience for a cryptocurrency for me to have to find some way to get this JSON file or this text file over to the user that I want to send money to. And oh, by the way, then he has to send something back to me at the same time before I can send him money. So number one, you have to be online, right? Similar to Lightning, you have to be online. But then as well, you have to find some other way of sending this data to user. And their challenge is if they offered something on chain, it could be DDoSed because you're not paying money for it, right? There's no way to actually compensate these nodes that are just relaying data back and forth. You know, unlike the Lightning Network where the communication channel goes through the people that lock up money and charge fees for having locked up money. So at least had a communication channel, but the other MimbleWimble implementation, they didn't. And this is where I bring back to Litecoin, where I think they've figured out some groundbreaking implementation for it is that they've made it non-interactive, non-chatty. They figured out how to make the protocol such that you can publish an address and being offline, someone can send money to it. Now it becomes interesting. Now, from that viewpoint, I will claim ignorance that once they figure that out, I don't fundamentally know the core privacy benefit difference between MimbleWimble and like a Zcash. To my knowledge, they'd be relatively similar, but I'm probably going to get slammed by somebody, either in the MimbleWimble side or on the Zcash side, as far as what the trade-offs are. Now that the interactivity part is solved, I'm more of a UX guy, even though I'm a developer. So to me, the UX is what killed it. But since that's, I'm told, solved in Litecoin with MWeb, now it's a little more ambiguous. Maybe MimbleWimble solves the scalability problem, which, you know, maybe Zcash hadn't. But once again, that's for another discussion because I'm stepping outside of my pay grade there.
Well, I do hope I'm gonna get David Burkett, who is the
Yeah.
Grin++ developer who made this possible, get him
Yep.
on the show to ask him more questions because it's definitely intriguing. And it's something that can come to Bitcoin as a soft fork. And that is also interesting because the other conversation that is usually had around privacy is that it requires a hard fork. And whenever people mention the hard fork, they say, okay, that's no deal. It's a deal breaker. It's something that they don't want to happen.
It can come to Bitcoin with a soft fork, but realize if it's going to feel like Litecoin, it's really just another chain. At that point, you hold it balance somewhere else and you send transactions like kind of somewhere else. So at that point, it might as well just be an L2 because the user experience is the same. And I'm open to being challenged on this. Like, hey, is there a way to make the quote unquote extension block sidechain integrate much more tightly with the main L1 chain versus having to put money in it, transact in it, and then take money out to transact on the L1? If it feels like that, then at that point, it's just another L2, maybe a ZK rollup, right? Because the user experience is the same. So that's the thing to probably ask David, right? Is can you make it more integrated? And when I say more integrated, think like Zcash has a transparency mode, which I hate that it has that, but it integrates a bit more seamlessly in the sense that transparent funds can send to a shielded address. You can source shielded funds plus transparent funds in the same transaction to go out to a shielded address and a transparent address all in one transaction. So it feels like the same chain, just different kinds of addresses. Can MWeb do that? Or do you literally have to be on this other block with your funds that then kind of peg in, peg out? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, as far as I know, based on my experimentation, you always have to peg out when you make a transaction outside.
Right.
You
So at
can't
that
have
point,
one transaction which has both this on-chain transparent operation as well as something on the MWeb.
right. In that case, why bother with the soft fork? Soft forks are a big pain in the ass. They complicate the code. At this point, just use whatever you want to call a sidechain, a ZK rollup, because it's the same experience. You peg in, you peg out.
Well, I guess that's a valid point. That's also above my pay grade. I don't really see the differences right now, so maybe I should look more into it.
Well, big difference. You don't need a side fork. You don't need a soft fork, right? A soft fork is a giant political war on getting it in. It's also insanely complex code. So to do SegWit was massively complex code inside of Bitcoin, whereas we can already do side chains once again, like I said, through Thorchain-like gigantic threshold signature multisigs, maybe drive chains or potentially ZK rollups. And so doing that basically leaves the L1 protocol alone, gets people into the L2, and then you transact with the privacy that you want. And from there, maybe we just go from the L2 to the other L2 of DeFi. And once again, the L1 dies.
Well, I never considered this, but it makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned the Lightning Network in your previous statement, and some people present that as the privacy solution for Bitcoin. As for the sender, it is pretty private, and some people figured out ways to build Chaumian and eCash on top of custodial Lightning, and they say that it's basically the scaling and the privacy that Bitcoin needed, even though it's custodial, and you must trust that.
Yeah, I think once it's a custodial solution, it's dead. It's dead to me. Right. I got into Bitcoin for self-custody. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, but I'm a self-custody maximalist. And so that to me is not an option. That is a cop-out that I know. I think if you're in the Lightning community and that is what you're selling as the solution, that is a cop-out to the narrative that was presented to us years ago. And the fact that that's even been proposed, I think, is blasphemy as a solution as opposed to actually trying to solve the real problem. And it starts to beg the question, is that being proposed because the real problem cannot be solved? Like we actually cannot scale to get people on Lightning easily and transacting. Um, if if that's the case, then throw it out the door and let's just move on. Let's try to find a better solution for Bitcoin, and throw out all the engineering effort that was put in, because sometimes that happens. Google has done a ton of different projects and put a ton of engineering effort into something that it ends up throwing out. And one of the narratives of Lightning was that the nice thing about what they're doing is that it doesn't affect the L1. And if there's any issues and it doesn't work, it doesn't affect, the original L1 at play. And so if it's proving that it doesn't work, use your own narrative and say, let's go build something that does, and help Bitcoin still succeed. Um, and so, yes, Lightning does provide a level of privacy way well above Bitcoin. No question about that. It also then, it does, however, one part about privacy is what you call like an anonymity set. right? Making sure that you have a high anonymity set amongst people that are transacting in a privacy protocol, whether it be crypto or messaging like Signal. And unfortunately, one of the challenges of Lightning is it reduces the anonymity set because it drives users through centralized channels, right? You drive through the high liquidity channels and then out of the high liquidity channels. And so those highly centralized entities will have a much stronger ability to de-anonymize the traffic that's going through them because they potentially are the only hop. All right. If it's very, very centralized, you're going to end up having very few hops on the network. And imagine if I wanted to transact with you, Vlad, and there was only one hop between the two of us, that hop being a very, very large, highly liquid Lightning node. That effectively means that highly liquid Lightning node knows my IP address, and it knows that I'm sending money. It knows your node and your IP address, and that it knows that you're the one receiving the money. So it does create a significant de-anonymization. Now, if there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of nodes, and we have to create multiple hops, right? The onion routing protocol of Lightning does make it where any node in the middle doesn't really know where the money's going to end up. And that's awesome. Problem is, you need to have multiple hops, and it costs more money to have multiple hops. It's capital inefficient. For me to send one Bitcoin to you in a 5-hop network, 5 additional Bitcoin have to be locked on the network for my one Bitcoin to successfully get over to you. So you increase capital inefficiency in order to increase privacy. Right? Capital inefficiency is the direction that the network wants to take, naturally wants to take, and that significantly decreases privacy. So it's a nuanced, tough one, and fundamentally, I think that the incentives are misaligned long term at scale for Lightning to provide a good amount of privacy.
So I guess I also got my answer to the question, should we expect to see the Lightning Network being integrated into Edge Wallet?
We tried. We gave it an honest try, and I give my hats off to the companies and projects that have made it far easier than it would have been years ago. Like Roy from Breeze, we've been talking with his team, looking at the SDK. I'm like, wow, this SDK on paper looks like it would be pretty easy to use. But in testing it, not integrated into Edge, but just testing the SDK raw by itself, we quickly found routing issues very easily at very low amounts. And there may be still some use case for Lightning that I just haven't quite foreseen at scale. But even he admits, like, hey, like you can maybe route $2,000 pretty reliably through Lightning. And the definition of Edge is a self-custody exchange. And let's face it, like, when you go to exchange, you really want a $2,000 limit on a transaction. People expect significantly higher limits. And so by the definition of our app, it's not a good fit. Sure, you can make small payments, buy cups of coffee. And while people do that with Edge using other cryptocurrencies, it's not the design of our UX. It's not for payments. I used Edge to pay over Monero at a bunch of places over at PorcFest. But it's one of those that you can do. It's not designed to be the most fluid UX for it. And so, for Lightning, yeah, go get a Lightning wallet. Most of them just do Bitcoin and Lightning and nothing else. Or they do it custodially. Ironically, the multi-asset apps that support Lightning, to my knowledge, do it through a custodian, which we're not going down that path ever. Like, no way. That's dead to us.
I do like the fact that you are super pro self-custody. And that's the primary feature that you're going to find in Edge Wallet. It's uncompromisingly non-custodial. And that's the whole point.
Exactly.
Even if you have to use other currencies that are not Bitcoin, at least you're not going to a custodian to ask for permission to transact the funds, and there is no counterparty risk involved.
All right. That is definitely a definitive goal of ours. And to kind of elaborate or at least refine that goal is we're trying to bring self-custody to even the people that don't care, right? We want to bring it to the average Coinbase user that's like, just trying to, trade a little bit of Bitcoin, buy some, trade it. Because I think just like privacy, the more people that are in self-custody, the more the people that care about self-custody benefit. right? You could imagine that if you and I, Vlad, were the only people that care about self-custody, would we have many tools to use it? Would we have friendly regulation for self-custody? Chances are no, right? We would just be the two people in the woods, with our private keys written on a piece of paper and probably no ecosystem around it. So the more people that do use self-custody, the higher the demand is to build tools that interface with it, that make it usable, and to build a regulation that's friendly around it. So we want to deliver it to people, even the ones that don't care about it, because that adds to the total of people using self-custody. And then we benefit, the ones that actually care. And the same thing for privacy, right? If we were the only two people using Signal, Signal would probably die. We wouldn't have the tool available to us. But at scale, I've onboarded friends to Signal that don't care about privacy at all. Now they use it, create their little groups when they travel around and chat with each other in other countries. They're using Signal. And now the anonymity set of people using Signal has grown. We're no longer, the only two people using Signal that the government thinks are using it to trade drugs, and child porn and whatnot, or they think. But now it's just everyone just using their normal day-to-day chats, right? And the people that care about privacy are folded into that anonymity set amongst all of the people that don't. And it's just normal chatter. So I think that's important. I think building tools, even for the ideological tools, even for the people that don't have that ideology, is vastly more important than people realize.
I want to ask you, Paul, what is the most controversial opinion that you hold about Bitcoin? Something that is so scandalous, so outrageous that in most conversations you're afraid to express it. And while you think about it, let me tell the listeners about hodling.ch, which is a service from Switzerland that supports you in your journey to self-custody. So if you're a big holder of Bitcoin, or maybe that you're part of a company that wants to add Bitcoin to its balance sheet, and you don't know how to manage this because it's a lot of money and it's not always your money, then you can go to these guys. You benefit from the confidentiality provided by a Swiss company. And they are also going to tell you which hardware wallets you should be using, whether or not you need them at all, if you need to set up a multisig or a Shamir backup or something like that, and how you should distribute it for the purpose of securing your seed and making sure that you eliminate single points of failure. So check out hodling.ch. And thank you very much for sponsoring the show. Now back to the question, Paul. What's your most unpopular opinion about Bitcoin?
God, it depends who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to most maxis, it's like I can name half a dozen things. From I think we should increase the block size. I think you should just kind of give up on developing Lightning and work on the L2s. To, I mean, heck, what we talked about earlier is probably super controversial. I think the L1 will die, in several decades as we adopt the L2s. And that would actually be a very, very fair and just and good end result. It would be a net good for Bitcoin if the L1 just dies over a period of time. And so how much more controversial can I get than that one, right? And so yeah, because I'm not a maxi, I always present a lot of the ideas that come out of the other chains. And with that, I think that'll end up being, many of them will be pretty controversial. And so I think the ETF sucks. How about that? I think it sucks, but that's not even controversial. A lot of people said that, right? It's like, it's almost like I can't find anything controversial because someone else has said it and it's been a narrative. Because what makes these things controversial, these ideas controversial, is when someone is very hard set on the religion of Bitcoin. If you're not hard set on the religion of Bitcoin, it's actually kind of hard to be controversial, right? And so, yeah, any of those things. Yeah, sure. The L1 in several decades can and should give way to an or a couple different L2s that then have all of the security budget and no one transacts on the L1.
Well, let me
Try
tell
that.
you something
Try that
controversial
one.
about yourself and this opinion that you presented. Basically, you are a maximalist because you're unloading some of the weight that could have been in the Bitcoin blockchain and putting it in other chains, right? So
I'm
you're
a
helping Bitcoin
maximalist.
scale, right?
I'm helping Bitcoin scale, and I guess I'm helping as in I'm promoting the L2s. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and you're also promoting Bitcoin and you're helping the number go up, even if you're maybe trading with other coins and maybe buying Bitcoin at the end of the bull market cycle, assuming that you do that, which most people do. That's still being a Bitcoin maximalist, because in the end you come back to the one coin that rules them all, which was the original idea about Bitcoin maximalism.
Well, I am also skeptical for Bitcoin to be able to achieve its goals based on the community and its religion. So when I say, yeah, I think the L1, can and should, and it would be beneficial for it to die over the next several decades, and that an L2 rises that then becomes where all the transaction, that whole narrative that I just said. Well, I think that is an okay and ideal, and not ideal, but I'd say a positive future for Bitcoin. I am skeptical of it being able to achieve that because of the hard set um, religion and the fanatical opinion that many people have around Bitcoin. And so, because of that skepticism, I do hold other coins. I transact with other coins, and I promote other coins to people. And while I do hold most of my value in Bitcoin today, in no way do I make a promise or a stance that I think that will necessarily be that way tomorrow. Right. So, because of that, I think that would be far from anyone calling that a Bitcoin maxi. Trying to improve Bitcoin and think that there are paths for it to improve is one thing, and promoting those paths and supporting those paths is one thing. But trying to say that Bitcoin is the only thing interesting, um, and that nothing interesting has come out of these other chains, which is what most Bitcoin maxis would say, and that I wouldn't hold any of those chains are all shitcoins, which is what a Bitcoin maxi would say. Um, those I would never. I don't feel that way today, and I haven't felt that way almost forever. Um, so yeah, I don't think I'd consider myself that at all.
Well, there are nuances involved, but we can get there too, because Satoshi himself, he was not a maxi by today's standards. He
Oh my
did
Jason, why not? Definitely
contribute
not.
to the
Yeah,
creation of Namecoin, which was the first altcoin. And there was someone at
right.
the time in the forums who was considered to be the original toxic maxi, who basically said, it's a bad idea to create a different currency that competes with Bitcoin.
And that wasn't Satoshi. You're right. So I guess I'm closer to Satoshi in that regard. That's pretty hefty bragging, but only in that regard. Only in the regard that yes, I'm very open to other chains having other functionality that Bitcoin possibly may not may not actually absorb that functionality into it, at least not as well.
Well, there is definitely a market for stuff that's not possible on Bitcoin.
Oh, absolutely. Like I
So
said,
who's
wrap
who's
Bitcoin
gonna do
has
that?
wrap Bitcoin still has, like, I wish I had the exact number, but more liquidity locked in it than Lightning has
Oh, by
by orders.
20x or
Yeah,
something, yeah. So
exactly. So there's
it's more than
clearly demand.
Lightning and Liquid and Rootstock
Right.
and
Oh,
all of
oh yeah,
these layer twos combined.
exactly. So there's clearly demand for the additional functionality that other chains have, but having that functionality with Bitcoin, clearly a demand.
Yeah, and I did interview a bunch of people who were trying to create solutions to make the WBTC migrate towards something else.
Yeah, it can improve, especially like I said, WBTC is nothing more than a multi-sig with a small handful of companies, and it can migrate to something much better, such as, like I said, like a Thorchain, right? 40, 80 threshold signatures locking up Bitcoin and minting a tokenized version of it.
Coming back to Edge Wallet, I forgot to ask you about hardware wallets and whether or not you plan to allow users to sign transactions using them or use them to authenticate or import wallets from them.
You can definitely import wallets from a hardware wallet. You can do that. You just put in your public key, public seed, I mean, and obviously it's no longer a hardware wallet at that point, right? It's in software. Using a hardware wallet, it's crossed our minds a few times here and there. We feel like they're not like that 90% self-custody adoptable solution. We've been exercising kind of thought process around multi-sig and threshold signatures instead to find a solution that we think is more mass adoptable. Fundamentally, I don't like people having to write down a seed. So while a hardware wallet might be a more secure digital device, the risk of people compromising that actual written down seed is potentially quite high. Um, And I think people discredit the risk there, but both losing it and um, putting it in a bad place that gets it compromised. So I think the future with threshold signatures opens up what could easily be a much more usable alternative, especially like social recovery, co-signing devices that you may have in your possession, like computers, watches, and whatnot. And fundamentally, I think long term, that's what we're going to see as the kind of more mass adoptable vault caliber security. I guess that's the way I kind of bucket all of these things, like the vault caliber security, whether it be hardware wallet or threshold signature multisig. I lean more into the latter, the threshold signature multisig, as being, that 90% adoptable vault caliber security with nice flexibility on rule sets by which things signs and amounts and whatnot. So don't currently have hardware wallets in a roadmap, but things can change. If we really hit roadblocks with threshold, then maybe we do hardware.
You did mention something interesting about the way that you prefer to onboard users. And today, when I was playing before this interview with Edge Wallet, I did notice that after installation, there is no requirement to write down the seed and then verify it, which is pretty standard across wallets. But you have a different scheme. You set up this PIN, and you can also set up an account, which is more traditional. And I guess for some people, it's more natural as opposed to writing down 12 or 24 words and then verifying randomly a few of them.
Yep, exactly. So this is part of our initiative to onboard the masses into self-custody, not just the people that care about it. And so, like we like to say, we're not trying to compete against the other wallets. We're competing against the centralized exchanges. We're competing against the Krakens, Coinbases, the Geminis that a lot of people are using, and stay within those services because they feel like their bank account. So Edge employs, an account-based system. It feels like an account, but it's fully client-side encrypted, right? Encrypted and then backed up, and then two-factor protected. So if someone was using a password manager to store those credentials and their password manager gets compromised, or they wrote down their password, put it under their keyboard, and then that gets compromised, the account is still protected. And it's that extra layer of protection that we can provide in addition to encryption, in addition to the fact that there's an actual real private key under the covers that is what you own and control. All those layers are what we can do to provide a user experience that is more akin to what people are used to and still self-custody. And I think now we don't know a lot about our user base, because it's a very private app. We don't know demographic information. We are provided a little bit of demographic information and psychographic information from our exchange partners, fiat exchange partners, because they have to collect KYC, but we don't get that KYC, right? And those fiat exchange partners don't get account information. All they see is KYC and then maybe one address for someone to buy Bitcoin, right? But they do give us some of that feedback as far as, anonymized information. And they can attest that in comparison to their other partners, Edge has a high degree of newbie users and even elder users. And I think that's a testament to us having made it easy, right? We've made it easier than most of average. And that demographic will refer that demographic to us. So it's a different model. Admittedly, it will alienate the long-time crypto, I'll call them like 24-word maxis. Like, I want to see those words, where I'm going to write them down, put them in my safe. Like, it'll alienate those people. And our initial hope, right? And that's what we're betting the company on, is that is a small percentage of the total global population that wants to adopt. And if you think about it, it's already a small percentage of the people that just simply use an exchange and don't give a shit about any of that. They don't care. They only do not care about self-custody. They don't even care about their own privacy, because they just go right to an exchange, buy, leave it on there. And so that's who we're targeting, are those people. And we want to give privacy and self-custody to those people that would normally have been on just Coinbase.
Yeah, to me, it's interesting, and I'm really proud of your project and how it
Oh,
evolved.
thank you.
Because honestly, I don't, or at least not up to this point, I didn't really use Edge. I didn't feel like it was the solution for me. I've tried the other stuff. I tried full nodes. I tend to migrate towards these if I get the option. I'm a nerd. I do like to run nodes, even if I prune the data afterwards. And to me, it's interesting that you're able to integrate all of these features within a very slick user interface. And to everyone listening right now, where can people download Edge and where can they follow you personally?
Both are the same place. So edge.app. So if you head to edge.app, we'll have links to the app stores. You can also do a direct download on Android if you don't have the Play Store on your phone. Direct download right into your Android APK. And then through there, you'll find me. Me and my co-founder, the two staff members listed on there. And then my Twitter profile is on there. I think my LinkedIn's on there as well. And so that's the one spot to easily find both me and information about the company, and as well ways for you to download Edge. You did mention one thing really early on in this podcast that I wanted to slightly correct. Edge is currently only mobile. It's not on the desktop, unless you're on a MacBook M1, M2, M3, where you could download iPhone apps onto your desktop and run them. So that's the one case that Edge is on the desktop. And actually works really well. I use it all the time, on my actual MacBook. But no, it's mainly designed for mobile. And we do have desktop on the horizon, but it's still a bit of ways. It's something we do want to deploy. But for those fortunate enough to have an Apple Silicon MacBook or Mac Mini or whatever, any kind of Mac, you could run us on the desktop.
Yeah, I think that's why, because I have a Mac and I found that version that I could download on my computer. And now it makes a lot of sense why there's no Windows or Linux
Yeah,
version.
it still feels kind of like a mobile app when you run it on desktop. It doesn't have all of the normal desktop type of user experience, but it's very usable. I'm shocked that actually Apple did a great job of translating, the mobile gestures and user experience into desktop very well. So very usable, and we'll hopefully improve that, and then as well launch a true desktop native app that will then be across different platforms. But still a bit further into the future.
Do you believe that the future is mobile and everyone's going to be doing all of this Bitcoin stuff on their phone?
For sure, the future, if not, I don't say the future is mobile. The present is mobile, no question about it. I think mobile first is where we are, and then desktop happens to be for very specific use cases. So it's mobile. We're in a mobile first world where desktop is now the niche, and cryptocurrency trading is one of those niches, right? That mandate a desktop. So since that is the field we're in, we need to enter the desktop space as well. Whereas our original app was for payments, just send and receive, and so you barely needed a desktop app for that. But yeah, we can and we should have a desktop app.
Paul, I'm not sure if I have any more questions at this time, even though it's a
Cool.
shame because you're a treasure in terms of information.
Oh well, thanks. I can only credit that to the many people that I've been able to learn from, over the many years. And so, but admittedly, as much as you may think that I'm a treasure, the industry has grown to become so much larger than I can keep up with. And so, many other great and interesting minds that I'm sure you have had on your show that can augment, if not surpass, everything I've been able to provide.
You're being
But thanks for
modest.
having me.
But also, you mentioned something about a debate that you're going to have next week with a Bitcoin maximalist within your community.
Yeah.
Do you want to advertise that? Should people watch that?
Yeah. Whoever happens to be local in Southern California, LA, San Diego area. It's going to be here in San Diego. If you look at SD Bitcoiners, SD standing for San Diego, SD Bitcoiners. They meet every month at a great brewery over here in San Diego. Shoot, suddenly the brewery name just kind of skips my mind. But if you look up that, they're on meetup.com. You'll find the locations. I think it's like 6 or 6:30 p.m. The usual evening Wednesday meetup time. So it's next Wednesday. I think it's August 8th. And so definitely check us out.
Yeah, do that.
No, no,
Learn
no.
from
You
Paul
say third.
because he
August
definitely has a
3rd.
lot of interesting points. So thank you very much for your time, Paul, and I hope I'll get to do this once again in a year or two, and you're gonna have
Yeah,
great news about Edge. Maybe
we'll
you're
do.
gonna replace Coinbase.
That's our goal for sure. And if anything, because we're so private, we don't know what people are doing in the app. Please give us feedback. Vlad, you said you hadn't used it in a while. Definitely, if you've had Edge installed, give us feedback on what you see, what you experience in the app, what you stumble into, what you don't like, what you do like. And as well, all your listeners, please send us some feedback. We have no other way of knowing, because like I said, we don't track users in the app. So yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for listening.